Welcome back to SigmaRecon, where we give you the unadulterated and unbiased truth. China's ailing economy is at a breaking point. Could it force military action or restraint on Taiwan? Let's dive in. So Beijing faces an impossible equation: maintain economic growth to stay in power, or risk everything on Taiwan and potentially destroy the economy that keeps the Communist Party legit. Here's China's economic reality in 2025. GDP growth is at 5.3% in the first half of the year, the slowest in decades outside of COVID. The property sector, once 25% of the economy, has collapsed, wiping out $15 trillion in household wealth. Debt has exploded to 300% of GDP. That's government debt, corporate debt, household debt, all piling up while growth slows. Youth unemployment officially sits at 15%, but the real numbers are likely higher. Beijing needs around 5% annual growth to maintain social stability and fund military modernization. They view Taiwan reunification as a core national interest. But here's the catch: any military action could destroy the economy foundation that keeps them in power. So Xi Jinping's team faces a brutal trade-off: pursue Taiwan and risk economic collapse, or maintain economic stability and let Taiwan drift further away. The numbers favor restraint, but political pressure builds daily. The safest economic play is doing nothing. Maintain the status quo while focusing on domestic growth, but can Beijing politically afford patience when Taiwan grows stronger every year? So what if China just waits? Maintains current tensions without escalation? The economic math strongly favors this path, but politics may not allow it. Under the inaction scenario, China continues economic coercion, trade restrictions, diplomatic pressure, while avoiding military action. They keep importing Taiwan semiconductors worth $100 billion annually, maintaining access to advanced chips their entire tech sector depends on. The economic benefits are clear. China avoids sanctions, maintains trade relationships, and can focus resources on domestic growth initiatives. They're sitting at $1.4 trillion in household savings that could fuel consumption if properly unlocked. But there are costs. Foreign direct investments fell 8% in 2024 as tensions persist with the U.S. The United States has imposed tariffs and continued strangling supply chains. Every year of delay lets Taiwan strengthen its defenses and deepen international partnerships. The calculation is stark. Inaction supports 4 to 5% growth while preserving Taiwan's trade flows. It's economically optimal, but politically risky for Xi, who has staked his legacy on reunification. But what if Beijing can't afford to wait? What if they choose the middle option: economic strangulation without full invasion? Let's examine the blockade scenario and its crushing economic costs. A naval blockade looks like a perfect middle option: pressure Taiwan without full war, but the economic reality is devastating. China would strangle itself before Taiwan submits. Here's how a blockade backfires economically. China enforces quarantine inspections in Taiwan Strait, disrupting $1.4 trillion in annual trade that flows through these waters. The immediate costs are crushing. Rerouting ships around the blockade adds 15% to shipping costs across Asia. China imports 70% of its oil through the Taiwan Strait. Energy shortages hit within weeks. International response escalates quickly. G7 nations impose $358 billion in targeted sanctions. Global supply chains reroute away from China permanently. Manufacturing hubs in Guangdong and Zhengzhou start shutting down as companies can't reach factories. The economic damage compounds daily. Unemployment spikes, inflation soars, and China must redirect massive resources to sustain the blockade. First-year GDP losses hit 8.9%, and that's if the blockade succeeds quickly. If the U.S. intervenes militarily, costs explode. What started as economic pressure becomes a prelude to full war, with global economic losses reaching $2 to $5 trillion. A blockade map is brutal, but invasion is an economic catastrophe. Let's examine what happens when Beijing chooses the ultimate gamble, and why economics make it nearly impossible to sustain. Full invasion promises decisive victory and economic annihilation. China would win Taiwan and lose everything else, creating a Pyrrhic victory that destroys both economies. An invasion scenario starts with massive military costs. Conservative estimates put the first year around $200 billion minimum. not counting occupational expenses. But that's just the beginning. Global sanctions would be unprecedented. The US, EU, and allies represent 40% of China's export markets, roughly 1.2 trillion in annual trade, and vanishes overnight. Energy imports get choked off. Technology transfer stops completely. The target itself gets destroyed in the process. Taiwan's semiconductor fabs, the prize China seeks, are incredibly fragile. TSMC factories can be disabled by precision strikes or even power outages. The 90% of advanced chips China currently imports from Taiwan become unavailable not because of sanctions, but because the infrastructure is rubble. The numbers are catastrophic. GDP drops 12.5% to 26.9%, depending on conflict duration and international response. Capital flight accelerates as investors flee Chinese markets. Reconstruction costs for both Taiwan and Chinese military losses could exceed $1 trillion. Even victory becomes defeat. China gains control of a destroyed economy while its own collapses under sanctions and war costs. But let's assume China wins quickly and decisively. What does economic victory actually look like when you've destroyed what you came to capture? China controls Taiwan's territory but inherits an economic wasteland. The semiconductors they invaded for are gone. The population is hostile and costs never stop mounting. Post-Takeover Reality destroys the invasion economic logic. Taiwan's infrastructure suffers $1 trillion in war damage. The skilled engineers who made TSMC possible have fled to South Korea, Japan, or the United States. China's attempt to leverage Taiwan's 60% share of global advanced chip production fails because the ecosystem is people, not just factories. Rebuilding takes decades, not years, while global competitors like Samsung and Intel capture abandoned market shares. International isolation continues indefinitely. Sanctions don't lift after military victory, they intensify. China loses access to 40% of its export markets permanently while carrying the cost of Taiwan's reconstruction and a hostile population. The math is unforgiving. Short-term military gains create long-term economic stagnation. China wins territory but loses its possession of global economy, triggering domestic unemployment, inflation, and threatens Communist Party rule. China's Taiwan Gambit doesn't just devastate Chinese and Taiwanese economies, it crashes the entire global system. Understanding these worldwide costs reveals why every major power has skin in the game. A Taiwan conflict doesn't stay regional. It triggers the first truly global economic crisis of the digital age, with costs that make 2008 look manageable. The global economic cascade starts immediately. Taiwan Strait closure halts 6.5 trillion in annual trade, roughly 20% of all global maritime commerce. Semiconductor shortages spike electronics prices 20 to 50% worldwide. Global GDP drops 5 to 10%, representing 2.7 to 10 trillion in lost economic output. The United States alone loses 5.7 to 7% GDP. Roughly $1.6 to $2 trillion as supply chains collapse and inflation spikes to 3 to 5%. Stock markets crash immediately. The S&P 500 drops 10 to 20% as tech companies face component shortages. Energy prices soar as 30% of global liquefied natural gas transits the Taiwan Strait. The United States adds $1 trillion in debt financing military intervention and economic support of allies, but America's diversification efforts through the CHIPS Act and reshoring initiatives provide medium-term advantages. China bears the heaviest long-term costs. While global economies adapt and diversify away from Chinese dependencies, Beijing faces permanent isolation from the economic networks that powered its rise. So the math is very clear. Every scenario except inaction destroys value for China while accelerating global economic decoupling. But if military options are an economic catastrophe, what's Beijing's alternative path? China's economic slowdown makes Taiwan inaction the only viable strategy. Blockade risks 8.9% GDP losses, invasion threatens 26.9% collapse. And even victory creates permanent economic isolation. The numbers favor restraint, but restraint requires alternatives. If China can't take Taiwan economically, can internal reforms unlock the growth needed to maintain power without external adventures? So we will be monitoring China's economy very closely over the next several years. If they begin to see growth, it could push a military objective into Taiwan. But at the current state, it's my opinion that China will sit tight with what they have. So if you've enjoyed this content, go ahead and hit the like button, and we'll be back next week with another one. Sigma Actual out.